Welcome everyone to the November 4th, 2021 meeting of the Bellingham Planning Commission. Heather, can you please call the roll?
Ollie Taishi.
Here.
Jed Ballou.
Here.
Rose Lathrop.
Here.
Mike Estes.
Here.
Barbara Plaskett.
Here.
Scott Jones.
Here.
And we're just missing Victor Crissetti. Oh, there he is right there. We have all of us here.
I don't think we had any minutes. Okay, welcome everyone. Tonight's agenda has one item. We're doing a public hearing on changes to the infill toolkit. Before we launch into that, as a public hearing, we will have an opportunity for the public to speak on the infill toolkit in just a moment. Before we get to that, we always try to take general public comments on other topics. So if you would like to speak to the commission right now on something other than infill toolkits, please raise your hand in Zoom and we will do some general comment. All right, last call for any hands from the public. Okay, not seeing any, we'll close general public comment and move into our public hearing. Mr. Ockett, do you want to get things rolling?
I'd be happy to. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good evening, commissioners. I'm Greg Ockett from the Planning and Community Development Department. Staff members joining me tonight are Kurt Nabefeld, Kathy Bell, Chris Cook, and Heather Avon is our recording secretary. And at this point, I will turn it over to Kurt and Kathy. They will be providing you with the bulk of the presentation tonight.
Great, thank you, Greg. Good evening, Commission. Kurt Nabefeld. We come before you tonight to discuss amendments to the infill toolkit. The toolkit was adopted in 2009 and was intended to increase housing choice in our community through compatible infill. This is why there are floor area ratios, landscaping requirements, so that new development fits within the existing neighborhoods. Due to the Great Recession and other factors, we didn't really see the toolkit being used very often until the last 5 years. Since then, we've seen a big uptick in its use, and this obviously has allowed us to identify some specific areas that need to be refined. Also, due to recent changes in our land division ordinance, and then one that you're very familiar with, the RM project, we believe we'll see an even higher usage of this, which means we need to take some strategic changes now to improve its use and functionality. This is the first step in a phased review of the toolkit, and these amendments are not intended to address some of the concerns you may hear about tonight. The current proposal is simply about making a good code easier to implement and refining it. We intend to engage in a separate process that looks at possibly expanding its use in other zones, as well as structural changes that address the difference between greenfield development and infill and true infill development. I liken it to the changing of the oil in your car versus dropping a complete new engine in it. We got a good car. It just needs a bit of maintenance. That new car can come in the next phase. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kathy to walk you through a PowerPoint presentation on the specifics of it. Thank you. Hey, Kathy, I think you're muted.
Is the opening slide available at this current time?
Yes, it is.
Perfect, thank you. So with this, I'm gonna have to scan through some of my notes because I think Mr. Nabefeld stole everything that I was going to say in the beginning. So I wanna make sure that I don't miss any important information. But what I will add here is, I think it's important for the Planning Commission to understand what the infill toolkit is and what it was intended for. And as it was previously stated, it is a kit of parts, and it does have very unique and specialized housing types, and 3 of which are shown on the screen are 3 of the 8 that are included in the existing toolkit. One of the things that we want the planning commissioners to recall and understand is that the infill toolkit was adopted through a fully vetted public process. And so this is not to determine if these infill housing types are appropriate. It's already been determined that they are. What is important is to look at the amendments that we are proposing and to come to the same conclusion that staff is presenting for your recommendation, is that we are making the existing regulations more user-friendly and will result more into the type of development that the city of Bellingham is looking for. I will skip this slide because that is a redundancy of what was already spoken. The only thing I will add here is that the land division ordinance, it does 2 things that were relatively unique, and the city adopted this in 2018. And one of the things that it does is it does allow the full use of the infill toolkit housing types in single family zones. And it is the only, currently it is the only land use process that allows an applicant to apply for those. And also it allows a 50% bonus through the cluster subdivision provision. So that, together with the RM project, we felt that this was timely and necessary to bring forward these amendments. Sometimes it's just as important to determine what is not included as it is important to determine what is included. So I think just to kind of start the parameters and the bookends of what we're looking at is the toolkit. The toolkit is a set of development regulations that work with other sections of the municipal code. And these amendments do not propose changes to those other development codes. It is also not proposing where the toolkit can be used, and as previously mentioned, and you'll hear it many times throughout the night, this is not a complete rewrite of the infill housing regulations. So what is it? The amendment proposed is intended to address how to better implement the toolkit and work better with other development codes. More specifically, proposed amendments are summarized by the headings shown on the slide. And each of these headings or bullets that you see, we are going to discuss in a little bit further detail in this presentation. So starting with the first slide is pedestrian-oriented development. And when you read the ordinance and you read the staff work, one of the things that you notice is that there's a lot of emphasis on pedestrian-oriented development. And what is that? Well, when talking about pedestrian-oriented development, we're generally referring to the public realm or pedestrian realm. It's all you can readily see and experience as you're walking down the street. Concerning residential development, pedestrian-oriented development emphasizes human scale features such as front porches, entries, generous windows, enhanced architecture, and landscaping. The current infill toolkit standards are prescriptively pedestrian-oriented, but the infill toolkit purpose statements lack the clear guidance or mandate for this type of development. And they also don't provide a great explanation of what pedestrian-oriented development is. We propose these amendments to the purpose section, and they're intended to remedy this. And this will give developers a clearer understanding of what is expected in project reviews, and it will also be especially helpful to staff when evaluating requests for modifications. So when you look at the picture that is shown on the screen, and you'll see us use this throughout the presentation, and some of them are pretty gross, simplified, or examples. But what we're trying to demonstrate is what's on the left is not pedestrian-oriented development. It lacks landscaping. It does have a pedestrian facility, but it lacks landscaping. All you see is garages. You don't see entries, and you see very long driveways. as opposed to the one on the right, you can see a clear delineation between the pedestrian realm, which is the sidewalk, as it goes up into the residential units, and there's landscaping center separating the vehicular traveled way from the pedestrian travel way. So more of not this, but this. Proposed code amendments place an emphasis on oriented first to a street with vehicular access via an alley or similar. The intent is to maintain the city streets as the community's primary vehicular and pedestrian corridors. A goal is to minimize the amount of private driveways that cause auto pedestrian conflicts with autos backing out across the sidewalks. So again, not this, but this. Both of these front streets, one clearly you have driveways or an automobile facility that crosses the pedestrian realm across most of its frontage, as opposed to the other access being off of the vehicular access being off to the rear. There's a clear pedestrian corridor that minimizes intrusions of the automobile. If an alley is not available or possible, then the design should minimize the presence of street parking garages, of street front parking and garages. And we've written some design standards and some development regulations to address this. So we're not saying that you can't have front loaded development, but it's when you do and how you do. And what you can see from these examples is the driveways have either been minimized, as well as the proportionality between the garage and the overall width of the unit, or there's some detail that has been provided in the driveway surface. Common pedestrian corridors. This is a new term. It's not new to our implementation of many of the modifications that we have been granting, but it is a new term that is in the code. And the infill toolkit housing is currently required to front on a street or a lane. A proposed amendment is to allow new development to front on a common pedestrian corridor. And this has been allowed by minor modification approvals. For example, we did one development of this up on Mahogany, which is north of the new Costco, which I don't know how many years it's been there, but it's still the new Costco to me. It's just easier to say that. And it's proved to be successful. And it's also something that we find use in a lot of other jurisdictions. And what these illustrations are really meant to present is a common pedestrian corridor can be provided in many different ways. This is not a one fits all. It is really meant to complement the design and the intended users and the space, quite honestly, where the pedestrian corridor goes through. So moving into our housing types, there are two recommendations within the ordinance that staff is asking for your consideration. Currently, the infill toolkit has a smaller and a small house housing type, and we are proposing to consolidate those into a single housing type and to appropriately name that small lot. And what we have chosen to do is to take the maximum lot size of what is currently allowed, which is 5,000 square feet. We are not proposing that there be any minimum lot size. And why are we doing this? Because what's really interesting right now, without going into a lot of detail, but there are different floor area ratios for the smaller houses. There are the small house, and under some circumstances, and those are the square footages shown there, that if you can actually get more floor area on a smaller house lot than you can under a small house. So it's this nuance that really hasn't worked well, and this is a great opportunity to fix that. It's just really interesting. The second housing type, currently duplexes and triplexes are permitted, and this second housing type that we are proposing is a fourplex. And one of the things that the Planning Commission may recall is in the RM project, when we changed the name of the duplex zone to transition zone, We also allowed up to 4 units to be attached within those transition zones. And keeping in mind that these housing types, duplex, triplex, and fourplex, they all have the same floor area ratio, the same green factor requirement, the same setbacks, the same height. They have all the same development regulations. So what we're trying to show here is whether you have a duplex, a triplex, or a fourplex, the bulk and mass of how this would fit into an infill opportunity is the same. There is a difference of impact, and staff isn't going to deny that. 3 units may have less impact than a fourplex. But from a mass and bulk and scale perspective, we would like the Planning Commission to consider this and to have some further discussion on this, because this is something that we wanted to bring forward for public consideration as well as Planning Commission discussion. So the proposed amendments to the bulk and massing, they're intended to encourage the use of all housing types. One of the things that we have found with the use of the infill toolkit is generally 2 or 3 housing types are being used. And we would like to see a broader range of these infill housing types being used. And when asked why others aren't using them, oftentimes there just isn't this balance. There isn't a balance between the bulk and mass regulations. And three of the main regulations that need to be balanced are the floor area ratio, the open space, and the green factor landscaping. And so I want to show you an exhibit. And this is meant for illustrative purposes only. It is meant to help you understand what floor area ratio is. You cannot do an infill toolkit as shown here, because no infill toolkits have a floor area ratio of 1. Okay, so it's a complete over exaggeration. But what we're trying to show you is what floor area does. Floor area can be provided in many different ways, and probably what is more appropriate to what is before you tonight are probably the 2 and 3 story versions, just because of the height limitations for most of our housing types. But what this begins to show is not only can it take different shape, but if you consume all your floor area and you spread it out, you have no open space and you have no ability for landscaping. But as soon as you start to take that same amount of floor area and you bring it up to another story, you start to create opportunities for open space. And when you create opportunities for open space, you also create opportunities for landscaping. So while you look and you digest that, here's some additional thoughts or considerations. A floor area ratio is the maximum building mass that can be developed on a property. All of these have the same floor area ratio. They look completely different, but they all have the same ratio. Open space is the minimum of land that must be free of building and impervious surfaces. That is what is being shown in green. That is open space, assuming there's no parking lots. And then green factor is the landscaping that you could put within those green spaces or the open space, but there's also an opportunity that you could do green roofs as well. So there's a lot of different ways for achieving the green factor score. Some of the public comment we've received is to eliminate the floor area ratio, and staff would like the planning commission to consider keeping the floor area ratio, as we believe that there's a benefit. And the infill toolkit is primarily a tool to accommodate small scale infill in existing residential neighborhoods, and that's the key. That's why this is the infill toolkit, and it's not just in our residential chapter, or it's not in our commercial chapter where you can do mixed use. These are unique housing types that have a unique implementation. So by keeping, we call it FAR, F-A-R, it ensures that the new infill development is consistent and fits in with the existing scale. And we are proposing to do some amendments to the current floor area ratios, and primarily it's intended to create greater parity in what's allowed between different housing types, to encourage the use of all, which I mentioned earlier, and also to allow discretion to increase the floor area ratio in greenfield developments, because we recognize that there's a difference between infill and they're different when you're creating new neighborhoods. And here is by far probably the most simplified version of green factor, but we really want you to understand how we do things today and what we're proposing. So the greenfield or the green factor landscaping has a provision in there for preservation. So bear with me for a quick example. All of the area that is shown in the lighter color is all encumbered critical areas, and say it's a beautifully forested wetland. If that were the case, you could essentially have a development, being kind of the darker gray, that would therefore require little to no landscaping. And that clearly is not the intent of trying to have a landscaping requirement. Or on the other, what we do currently today is we apply green factor, or we calculate green factor over the entire site. Well, what happens is then you're taking, for example, 3 acres of landscaping and you're putting those on the remaining 2 acres, and you can see it becomes very dense. And from a landscape architect's perspective, they don't believe that that is the best choice or the best way to provide plant densities. So what we're looking for is a balance, and we're looking for a balance of that we would determine the green factor landscaping score by just the developed area. And we think it's a great balance, and we would like to, and we're proposing that the Planning Commission consider that. In terms of landscaping, we are looking at just a few additional amendments. And one is the value of what landscaping has to an alley. And I think that this is pretty self-explanatory in that there is a much different feel and a much different sense of ownership and wanting to be part of what this is, as opposed to what not this is. And staff is recommending that there be landscaping requirements in the alley. Minor modifications. Currently, the infill toolkit allows minor modifications, and staff is proposing amendments to expand the applicability to include more discretion. We found that in certain infill opportunities, there are existing residences that have a lot of value and retention, and sometimes those cause extraordinary circumstances, and our code doesn't currently allow any opportunity to deal with those types of situations, and we would like to look at that. The others, we recognize greenfield development is different. We're creating new neighborhoods rather than infilling in existing neighborhoods. And there, what we're starting to see too is a mix of uses. So we're seeing apartments with townhomes that are actually being platted for a for sale product, and there's just some unique circumstances that present themselves. So we want to be able to look at those objectively. And as we go through these modifications, what we really are trying to do is to create developments with better design. And most importantly, we're going to go back to that pedestrian oriented development. And we want to make sure we can satisfy the purpose and intent of the chapter. And with only a few slides remaining, one of the additional recommendations we have is process. Currently, all infill housing proposals require 2 applications, an infill application and usually a design review application. What we're proposing is to take away or not require the infill application and just do it through our design review process. So requiring 1 application. In addition to that, we review applications through process types, and both type 1 and type 2s are administrative processes, meaning they're made at the by the director and or designee. And currently all infill toolkit proposals are type 2, meaning the scale of 2 units, 3 units is processed the same as 100 units. And we believe that there's a scalability that should be considered with this. The difference between a type 1 and a type 2 predominantly is a type 1 does not require notice to property owners within 500 feet of the site. A type 2 does. So currently all applications for infill, regardless of their size, are all notices sent out for all of those. So what we're proposing is to look at the scale of that, and we're trying to draw a parallel to what we do for 4-lot short plats. And currently 4-lot short plats are type 1s. They do not require notice, and 5 or more do require notice. Should you do a short plat with a bonus, that now becomes a completely different process type that requires notice. And so we would like to keep the same thresholds, the same concept and idea of that scalability, and to allow some of these infill housing applications to go through a much quicker process. Because we believe one of the things that we can do as a municipality to affect affordability is faster permitting. The faster we can get permitting and with good codes, then we can start to increase our supply at a much greater rate. Just real quick, as you've noticed in the code or in the staff report, looking at the ordinance, there are proposed changes to other code sections within that are needed to adopt our proposed amendments to the infill toolkit. Landscaping, specifically for green factor, design review is just what we discussed, is allowing it to be a design review application, as well as the process type from a 2 to a 1. The urban village is listed here specifically because there are urban villages that currently do not allow, they allow the infill housing, but they don't specifically allow the fourplex. So we are proposing to go in and to include that, as well as process. And I will close this presentation with asking the Planning Commission for their support of this proposal. And one of the things the staff felt most compelling is when you look at the staff notes that we presented and all the goals and policies that, in our opinion, speak directly to these proposed amendments, we felt it was pretty overwhelming, and that it has guided us to present this recommendation to you. And we ask for you to consider our amendments. We will hold the hearing tonight. I do believe that we have a work session scheduled for Thursday for the 18th. So we are not asking the Planning Commission to make a decision tonight. We would like to hear the public comment. We would like to hear the questions that you have. We are also open to, if the Planning Commission wants to keep the written record open for a certain time, staff is definitely open to that as well. So with that, I conclude my presentation. And if you have any questions of staff at this time, we are all available to answer your questions.
Great, thank you, Kathy. I'd like to turn it over to public comment, and then after that we can begin our discussion. Unless any commissioners have a pressing clarification or a question, but rather get into the meat of it after we hear from the public. Any pressing issues you want to run by staff real quick? Okay, I'm not seeing any hands on the grid. We'll turn it over now to public comment. We'll do 3 minutes. So raise your hand in Zoom if you'd like to speak. This is part of the public hearing. This is part of the record. So it'll continue on to the council after we're done with this process. So raise your hand in Zoom, and Heather, can you please call people in as you see?
Go ahead, Tom.
Hello, Tom Scott, I assume is who you're calling for. Were you talking to me?
Yes,
Okay.
Go ahead.
Sorry, it's hard to tell. I don't know how many Toms may be there. Okay, so for York neighborhood, I'm here on behalf of, as president, I'm at 1445 Grant Street myself. Basically, the primary issue at this point is just the late breaking nature of the whole thing. I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but we did send in a letter to the effect regarding the, I forgot how many pages it was, 80 or something like that, I seem to recall. But anyway, a fairly large document with a lot of proposals in it that we received, or we only had access to just like a day or so before our board meeting, with nobody having access to or having the time to review it. And indeed, it seemed like the publication was not quite far enough in advance for this meeting either, in terms of whatever was noted for, I don't know if it was a process requirement, but what was noted earlier in terms of when that would be published. As far as the actual meat of the whole thing, about the only thing the only one point I've got at this moment concerns going from type 2 to type 1 for 4 or fewer units, which can actually be combined with it being allowed in single family housing, which originally everybody was promised back in 2009 that wasn't going to happen. You can have a situation where you've got a house and then you add say a duplex to that in the back or whatever, is allowed through ITK, and there would be no notice because it's fewer than 4 units. And so now you go from, you're tripling or maybe even quadrupling the amount of traffic right next door to somebody with no notice. They just have to keep hunting through the permits on every other week to see if something's going to happen right next door to them. So that's a real concern. And like I said, the main thing though is just the lack of availability to the general public of the documentation showing what's being added and removed. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
Any other public comment? Last call.
Mike, does everybody know how to raise their hand? Just in case, we might want to look. At this point, I guess assume everybody's seasoned vet, but you never know.
Yeah. I don't know if someone would have trouble raising their hand, they could chat to Heather.
Yeah, that's true.
Which I think is actually easier to do. Okay. Not seeing any other hands, so we'll go ahead and close the public comment portion of the hearing and turn it over to our commissioners. Yeah, who wants to start?
Excuse me, Mike, can I have just one clarification? You made note of closing the public comment period, and then Kathy had also maybe suggested keeping the written period open for a certain amount of time. So maybe if you could just clarify that, do you intend to close public testimony completely or still allow written testimony?
That's great. So we're meeting in 2 weeks. There's a work session scheduled in 2 weeks if we want to continue talking. We should definitely keep the written record open up through a few days before that. I don't know if staff wants to pick a date. That'd be great, but I think we should close the audio portion of the comment. Before people drop off, can you go ahead?
I'm sorry. Yeah, we'd be comfortable keeping the written record open until the 17th, till the close of business on the 17th.
The day before the meeting. That's fine with me. Yeah. Scott?
Based on Tom's concern, maybe some people who feel more comfortable speaking instead of writing, could we keep the public comment for audio open just in case some folks want to say something after they have more review time?
If we're going to have another public hearing, we would need to notice that, Scott, and we need 30 days to do that.
And so verbal is different than written when it comes to public hearings?
correct?
Okay, if no one else has any concerns, then I'm okay with that too.
We will still have an open public comment period at the beginning of our work session that if people have a comment that they can say it at that time, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so we'll keep the written comment open until Wednesday the 17th. And we're gonna, yeah, close the audio portion. Okay. Discussion, comments? Ollie?
Thanks, Mike. Well, my first kind of question with stuff like this is almost more like a question of procedure about how we talk about it. I'm just curious if staff has any preference or thoughts, or if any other commissioners have thoughts on how we move through this, since it is a fairly big document, like just jumping around or going section by section, or, you know, I'm open to lots of different ideas. I just think we should talk about that before we dig in. Does anybody have
I
any?
personally, for continuity, would like for us to go through it in order.
I'm okay with that. It's broken into sections. You know, they're titled section 1, section 2. So if Barbara, I mean, just I'm okay with that approach, but curious what other people think. Mike?
Yeah, that'd be fine. Like, that sounds a lot better than hunting and pecking.
Yeah. I'm wondering too, I mean, there might be just some general overall questions that we want to get to before we dig into like the specifics of things.
Yeah, that's a good point. If we're anticipating the meeting again in 2 weeks, and if the details end up taking more than, you know, an hour and a half tonight, or however much time we want to invest on it, we can continue on the details at the next meeting. And so we might want to prioritize surfacing higher level questions and stuff, like general direction feedback towards staff, and then we can make a pass at going section by section and choose if we want to stop and pick that up. So does that, Ollie, could we do like a first round of every commissioner raising their high level questions and direction kind of stuff, and then go into the meat after that?
Yeah, that sounds like a great idea. Because you're right. I mean, like, there's details that I have some pretty random questions that I will spare everyone the suffering of in person, and I can follow up. So I like that approach. We may see some continuity amongst, you know, the topics that jump out to the various commissioners.
Okay, so if that's a good general approach, why don't we go around and do your high level thematic thoughts, you know, kind of what the intent was, scope and size, and questions you want answered, not on like bullet point details, but like big picture questions. And then we'll come back around and go section by section after that. Scott?
Thanks, Mike. This is about purpose and intent. It's on page 15, I believe, of the document. And it's regarding the scratch out of affordable housing. You know, everyone always talks about, and I believe that it's a true issue in our community. Density is something we talk about a lot. Those are two of my high points. And neither one of those are now in existence in this document. And we have housing choice and housing diversity. It doesn't say housing, but just diversity. And I'm wondering why the affordable housing was scratched out, since it actually is a part of our comprehensive plan. It's such an important part of our housing needs.
Okay, I'm going to pause right there. Staff, would you prefer we go around and kind of lay out a dozen questions like Scott, like in that same kind of type, and then you can, if there might be commonalities between some of the questions, and then you can take a passage addressing them all at once, or do you want to go one by one?
It's probably easier to get the questions all out, and then we can come back and hopefully tonight we'll be able to respond to some of those questions, and then if not, we can make sure that we respond to those in the work session. That's kind of what our thought is that the work session would entail us responding to public comments as well as any of those key components of that the commissioners have. So I think that maybe just kind of getting them out, letting us know what they are, will probably help us with that. And then once the commission has an opportunity to voice their questions and concerns, we might be able to take a stab at several of them tonight.
Okay, sounds good. So Scott, do you want to keep going with some more questions, and then we'll?
No, go ahead. Let's just keep going around the room.
Sounds good.
Thanks.
Next up.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and go. I'm very excited that this is being brought forward. This is like a little dream come true. So appreciate you guys making the effort and working hard on this. I know we had mentioned it during the RM, like if we're going to allow more infill toolkit, we wanted to make sure it was functional. And you had talked a bit about what worked and what hasn't worked in the infill toolkit, and that there are a few forms that are getting used a lot. I'd kind of like to understand more about how it's being used, to understand how much of it, because I know some of them are built in greenfield, some of it's actual infill, lots of them are townhomes, and they're beautiful. So it would be great to see some images too of what's actually been on the ground. So what has happened since the first one in 2015 or whatever year Peabody Townhomes was first built. And then of course, I have to ask the question, you had mentioned that kind of the scope of this process not being expanded to consider thinking about where other places that the infill toolkit would be appropriate. And I know that it might be nice to get a little historical background on where the infill toolkit came from and why. And then to understand why is this process, and there's probably good reasons, but to understand why we're not considering how we might utilize this tool in other areas and in other neighborhoods. And that's good for me for now.
Ollie, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm also excited to see this come forward. It's been it's been adopted for, like you said 2009, so 13 years, and that's a good long stretch to build up some experience with it and start figuring out what's working and what's not. We've had it through like different markets in our community, and so we have a good window to look at. And I think generally it's a lot of the stuff that everybody's been talking about that needs to change. So I think it's good. I most of my questions that I'm going to get into are like clarifications, I think, more than anything, trying to better understand it, because it's the first read through or second read through, sometimes it's hard to pick up how it might actually be put into practice. So I have interest in discussing in more detail, like the type 1, type 2 process, the process component, when design review applies, how we move to one permit, and just getting a little bit of clarity, because that manifests in ultimately in 5 different locations in the code that all tie together. And that was a little bit hard to track. And then really, I have a lot of similar clarifying questions on the pedestrian oriented or common pedestrian corridor, like this new alternative approach to access, and understanding how that works with a lane and an alley. And in particular, some questions about how alleys will be addressed when you front on a pedestrian corridor, because that's, front of house, back of house kind of thing. And those are probably the 2 biggest things for me that I'll be really interested in talking about. I have some other questions about understanding the green factor calc. Kathy, that image, might want to circle back to that and walk through that again. I think I understand what you're talking about, but I want to be 100% sure. So for me, I'm sure there'll be other things, but those 3 are probably the top 3 for me. Thanks.
Barbara?
So I'm curious about the environmental impact of some of these changes, and I want to know what we've done to address those. I'd also like to know how much consideration we've taken in including ADA apartments and ADA units. And again, I would also like to address why affordability has been removed. And is the single hot topic in our town. And I don't think this is the time for us to be abandoning those ideas.
Thank you. Jed?
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thank you for putting this together. And yeah, it's been an interesting read. I think the things that I'm most curious about are like, you know, we're looking at increasing density through some of the changes to the floor area ratio. And so I'm just kind of wondering, like, how did we land on these numbers? A lot of the numbers are pretty close to what was there previously. You know, we're going up like 0.1, you know, in a lot of cases. As well, like we've got a lot of height restrictions in, you know, the single family kind of areas where we're allowing 25 feet there, and then we go up to 35, and some of the other more, you know, commercial like multifamily district. You know, it's not atypical to have 35 feet tall, you know, single family. So I know some of the examples that we saw, you know, are 3-story structures, which you really can't meet with a 25-foot height limit. So, you know, especially on some of the small lots, I get the scale aspect of it, but I also see there could be some benefit to allowing taller structures on some of these lots. And then in addition to that, you know, I feel like that there's a lot of like push for kind of like traditional home forms, which, you know, I know people have an affinity towards, you know, kind of the traditional and matching existing historical styles. I feel like we've been having a kind of a, you know, a density of modern architecture in this city for a while, and it's been around long enough that I think it's somewhat familiar. So, you know, especially when we're looking at allowing for like things like green roofs count as part of your green space, you know, that kind of lends itself, relates pretty well to some modern styles of architecture, as well as, you know, it's like, do we really want to push for, you know, Bellingham's, you know, it's pretty filled up with housing. So we've got some areas that are left to be developed that are kind of out, you know, in the certain neighborhoods that have some green space, but for the most part, we've got existing neighborhoods. So are we really wanting to push these infill toolkit forms into being really traditional forms just to kind of tie into what the neighborhood feel is, or are we going to allow for some more kind of like one-off type of stuff? Sometimes it's the quirky things that make a neighborhood interesting and make a city interesting. So I feel like, you know, some of the language of this might restrict some of the creativity, some of the things that might make it a little bit more interesting. And so I just don't want to be too rigid and like, you know, kind of restrict the creativity of people. And, you know, some people may have a vision that isn't allowed in kind of the language of this. And so I think that's all I've got for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Jed. Next up, Victor.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to piggyback off what Barbara was saying about ADA. In the document we were reading, it was talking about including form of fourplexes. And I started reading other cities and tackling certain issues of fourplexes. One of the things that came up was it was saying that in a fourplex, it requires the ground floor units to be ADA compliant. So I wasn't able to verify that. I'm just curious to know if there is a federal regulation around that.
Okay, thanks, Victor. I'll jump in. I think we've been around once. Some of the comments we received had to do with permits, consolidation permits, and the lifetime of permits. And I was just curious if those were potentially compatible with the scope we're looking at here in terms of, and I wasn't following all the details, but I'd like to hear a little bit more about If you get the infill permit first and you have to wait on other stuff and wait on other stuff, is that 2-year window too short? And in practice, is that a barrier to some of these projects? And yeah, that's my main question for now. Circle back around to Scott.
All right, to continue, question about capacity and density. Will any of these changes increase the per unit capacity of the properties? Will developers be able to put more units on any one property? And if so, how? And then also, it's been talked about, I think Rose brought it up, about how this multifamily or the toolkit could be used in other ways, in other locations. I would like to know about where those locations might be and what kind of opportunities would come before the Planning Commission in the future for decisions to be made in other zoning locations or where other places would be.
Yeah, I had a similar thought as Scott on if we're trying to keep this scope small to move it more quickly and not add things onto it. If there is a promise of another round, is there any insight on the timing of when a second round of ITK conversations might happen?
And what it might include, because the unintended consequences of this document may occur in the future.
Yeah, I think a lot of the design requirements and the infill toolkit in general lends itself to be in other areas of the city, and to think about this in multifamily zones solely gives me a different perspective. And so when I think about it as a future potential in other areas, I have a different lens. Because when you're in residential multifamily, you already have a minimum density. Thank you all, Planning Commission and everyone, for making that happen. And but yeah, the different types of requirements that would be, it's sort of like penalizing ITK projects by adding these different design and green factor requirements if it's in the residential multifamily zone. That other projects of the similar density wouldn't have to adhere to. So just trying to kind of figure out the balance between the two and why one gets treated one way and the other one gets treated a different way. And then in public comment, and FAR is a tricky one to understand, but in public comment, there was, I think I read a couple of times people saying, why is there FAR? And is Infill Toolkit the only residential housing form that requires FAR? And then was there analysis done? Because and I did not do analysis because I don't even know how to do it. But looking at the mass and scale and setbacks and height limits that are already within the design parameters of the Infill Toolkit, how that balances with FAR. So do we really need to have FAR if we had all of those other components?
Ollie, did you have a hand up?
I did, but I was gonna riff on what Rose and Scott were talking about, and then Rose started talking about FAR after that, and I wasn't. And I took it down because I wasn't sure if we were just kind of sharing big themes still, or jumping into discussion about some of the themes that have been raised. So,
you got something to add? Go ahead.
Well, I think that the discussion about like where this is applied is important in terms of framing perspective on the rules, because Rose makes a good point about, you know, in a multifamily zone, this is really about just housing type choice, you know, and then that ties back to affordability and all sorts of big issues. And we want this housing form because it fills a gap that we don't have as a type of product in our community. And so like, I guess in the context of like making it work better in multifamily, it's to a certain degree, it's already got like barriers in front of it because it's competing against the ability to put an apartment in place. So when you look at like a financial analysis and go this or that, there's already barriers that make it maybe something that people will look at, but not automatically gravitate toward. And so reducing barriers is like the key thing we need to be doing here if we're thinking of it in the context of multifamily. Because every time we add some like little requirement that makes it harder or more restrictive than a standard multifamily project, that's like one more thing that a property owner developer is going to go, do I want to choose to do this? So that's a different approach than if it's like in a single family context where you're looking more at trying to make it fit into a single family character. That to me, that's a big focus there. So anyway, that's kind of a long riff, but you know, this idea of like, what are we trying to accomplish here? There's where this toolkit can be used, there's how it's implemented, and there are the rules you have to meet. And I feel like what we're dealing with tonight is how it's implemented, make that easier, more streamlined, and where or what rules you have to meet in it, the standards, not so much where it can be applied. That's like a separate topic amongst the three. At least we're being told that that shouldn't be a topic of this ordinance. So anyway, that's a long, I'm sorry, that's long, but I liked what the conversation was going on because it informs like how you think about what we're trying to do here. And I guess what I'm trying to say is if what we're trying to do is make it easier to use in a multifamily zone, we should think with all these decisions, we should think about, is this making it easier to use? Is it making it easier for this housing product to compete within a multifamily zone?
Yeah, that brings me to my second thought is along those lines. If we're going to explore different rules for greenfield versus existing built out infill in a future push, I'm wondering, looking at those pictures, like these look like great neighborhoods with the pedestrian oriented emphasis, but I hate to see them only pop up on the outer ring of town because that's where greenfield multifamily development is happening. What are the barriers? I guess my question is, what are the barriers to having an existing multifamily zone, existing built out multifamily zone take advantage of these pedestrian oriented walkable neighborhoods inside the core of the city? When you have an existing lot that's got an empty lot or an underused lot, if someone wants to do something creative, you can't just like come in and put cottage housing on a sole 5,000 square foot lot. Like, have people attempted to do interesting infill in multifamily zones? And what are the barriers to that? And is there anything we can do here to facilitate these great small scale things happening closer in, rather than like Ollie talks about in a multifamily zone, if these are too much of a burden to do the infill, you're just going to get an apartment complex. But in a close-in neighborhood, you're going to get just a big box McMansion instead of a smaller form. I think that we would love to enable people to use these smaller forms that are more character appropriate, when otherwise someone's just going to build out a maximum square foot single family house, and people are going to start to become opposed to that. Okay, do we want to pause here and give staff an opportunity to have a round of responses? Any last questions to add to the list? Okay, we'll switch gears for a moment. How does staff want to take it away?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I'll go ahead and take a first stab at a couple of these things. I think what I can do is address some of the issues, or at least some of the questions concerned. It all comes down to applicability, where the toolkit is allowed now, and what some have said maybe it should be allowed in. The toolkit was originally established with certain design parameters, including floor area ratios and height limits and design criteria to be true infill development. That's what the toolkit was designed for, is true infill development. We believe that the discussion, and we've said this many times, that there's a difference between greenfield development and true infill where you're putting these into existing established neighborhoods. And right now, the way that we're looking at it is these code changes will help it work better and more functionally in these existing infill situations where you've got established neighborhoods, and you are putting these housing forms into those established neighborhoods. So that's why we believe you need to have floor area ratios. That's why we believe you need to have design standards associated with them, because they need to fit within the existing housing context. Now, I think we'll all agree that greenfield development, when you're creating brand new neighborhoods, is different. And that's why we believe that there's this larger discussion that needs to take place, and perhaps even a whole new set of rules for true greenfield development when you're using these housing forms. So right now, again, we're focused on existing true infill development, and making sure that what's being built now is compatible with the existing housing form and style that's there now. I think one of the comments that was talked about was, why are we no longer having or scratching out the affordable housing? I think one of the things that we found is just because it's an infill toolkit housing form doesn't necessarily that it will bring an affordable housing price. And part of that is because of its lack of use and the lack of it occurring. What you've done and what the city council did with the RM project is going to expand the use of the toolkit. We're going to see more use because if you recall, we limited the amount of detached single family in these areas. And so what's going to happen is we're going to see this toolkit being used even more. So because of that, we believe that we need to ensure that we're still protecting or providing, an existing neighborhood with predictable rules and regulations and compatible development. That's different than when it's in the greenfield areas. We believe that one of the outcomes of the RM project is the possibility of affordable housing, or at least limiting the rate of increase on housing costs. So having more housing choice out there has the potential to affect affordability. But what we wanted to be sure that everyone realized is just because you do a townhouse or a toolkit housing form, that doesn't mean that it's going to be an affordable house until we get more of these out there. And once we start getting more housing choice and supply out there, which the RM project is going to do, which the updates to our land division ordinance is going to do, we felt that it was somewhat disingenuous to say that this is going to be affordable. The hope, and that's what the goal is, that it will be, but this is not, the toolkit is not the silver bullet to housing affordability. It's one of many that we're trying to do. I think one of the other comments that came up today was about ADA rules and regulations. The building code sets those standards already, regardless of whether it's an infill toolkit housing form or whether it's an apartment building or whether it's a standard single family homes. There are certain ADA requirements that are already dealt with, and the toolkit does not establish that. The building code already addresses all of those affordable or ADA requirements. One of the other comments that came up in both the written comment and the spoken comment tonight was the timing of or the lifetime of permits. That was one thing that came up in the RM project, and we acknowledged that. We have a separate process that's going to be moving forward that's going to address those timing issues. Right now, we don't think that the toolkit update is the appropriate place for that. It's kind of that next, we'll look at it holistically for all of our permits, not just the toolkit permit. So it's something that we identified in the RM project, and it's something that is on our work program to make sure that we bring that forward, is to try to align all of our different permit timeframes associated with it. Hopefully, the one other thing that I sort of mentioned on, but really want to talk about is that this amendment doesn't change where the toolkit is allowed. Those rules have already been established. We already know that they're allowed in RM zones. They're allowed in our urban villages. They're allowed in some residential single zones that have a cluster designation. So this project is not expanding where they should be looked at. Should we look at that? Yeah, we should. It's an important thing to do, but it's not in this process. This process, again, is to try and respond to issues that we've seen implementing the toolkit in the last several years. We believe that discussion of expanding it, potentially expanding it, needs to occur. Right now it applies generically across all of our RM zones, in our urban villages, in some of our commercial zones as well, and in certain residential single neighborhoods. And this process is not intending to expand that, but that discussion does need to occur at some point in time, just not right now. We believe it's an important one, and we'll be bringing it forward. But we don't want to slow down what we see as some necessary changes to make sure that this is functioning as it was intended, to have that greater debate about, potentially expanding its use. I think I tried to touch on some of the large topics there. I will turn it over to my partners here if they have anything to add on that.
I do have some things, Kurt. And thank you everyone for your comments, because there are some that have been spoken in a different context or in a different way that kind of makes you go, huh, that's some additional consideration, and that's what this public process is for. One of the things that I've had discussions with other staff members is, we talked about, will these amendments allow people to build more units on their site? And I think there's this narrative that needs to change a little bit. The floor area ratio, for some reason, is associated with density, and it is not associated with density. Floor area ratio is a calculation of how much building you can put on a lot. So the floor area ratio is going to determine how big your units are. The number of units you have is what zoning is going to dictate. So to increase floor area, to decrease floor area ratio does not affect density, because the zoning is what is establishing the density. So it's a narrative I think that we need to begin to understand as we start to go through this. When we talk about the barriers, one of the efforts that staff has put into this document is try to remove those barriers that we have been seeing with almost every single development that comes in of any scale. And we are really trying to look at what is the overall objective. The overall objective is pedestrian-oriented development. There's many ways to achieve that. The code allows the ability to achieve that in many different ways. That can go into greenfield development, and it can go into infill development. We think it's going to work in both. I believe, the amendments, they get at the crux of many of the barriers that have been presented. And why would someone choose to do the infill in multifamily over an apartment building? Ask the developers. They're doing it. And the projects are wonderful. So again, it is providing a choice, and that's what it is a choice. And it does offer some flexibility in setbacks and parking and other regulations that the standard multifamily development doesn't. So like any piece of property that a developer looks at, they've got choices, and they've got to weigh the market. They've got to weigh what they want, what product they want to bring on. Is it for sale? Is it for rent? Long-term, short-term? Those are things that we don't get to judge or choose, but we need to provide those options. And so far what we have found is the infill toolkit is a really good option It just is a little broken in some places. And what we're trying to do is to remove those barriers that, quite honestly, staff has been able to, in most circumstances, do workarounds, or we call them modifications, so that we can achieve what we're presenting to you tonight in the terms of pedestrian-oriented development. That's a lot of time on both the property owner, the applicant, and staff to work within these regulations and try to figure out how to make it work. And then so instead, we're just writing code so it will work. So we don't believe that we are coming forward with anything that is drastic. It's not drastically different, but we really tried to find that balance. And that's one of the things that we've heard from a lot of different people, whether it's the land use consultant, whether it's the architect, or the engineer. We've really tried to figure out how to bring a balance. So the question was asked, why is it the floor area ratio here, this number, and you're only increasing it, like a 0.1 or something? It's because it's what we've learned. In some cases, it's not enough. Some cases it's too much. And so same with the green factor. And so we're taking many applications, many units, and we've really tried to consolidate and compile with expert opinions, because we've reached out to engineers who have done this. We've reached out to landscape architects, land use consultants to say, hey, what about? Because we needed to measure ourselves as we were going through this. So we believe that the big picture is satisfied with the existing toolkit, is providing the options that this community has needed for many years. We now have more than single family and multifamily apartment units. We can honestly say that we've got good, robust numbers of alternative housing choices. And there's still an interest even with the toolkit as it is today. So what we're hoping is just to provide additional opportunity for the toolkit to make it more streamlined, more user-friendly, get more product on the ground faster rather than trying to figure things out, and just really working with these new set of regulations. And that's all I have.
Yeah, I just want to piggyback on a couple of comments that Kurt mentioned and such. One is concerning the affordability. There is no requirement right now in the infill toolkit for affordable units. There was a thought that when the infill toolkit was adopted, that it would result in opportunities for more affordable housing, and that made it into the purpose statement. The reality is the infill housing with its design standards results in really attractive housing that's not typically being built in neighborhoods. It's in our, by developers of that build standard single family with garage oriented development. So the infill toolkit results in development that's more typical of traditional development that you see in the letter streets and such as that. Absent of the infill toolkit, more of that housing isn't being built. So there is a demand for that style of housing. So when these infill housing developments do get built, they are going for higher prices than you would expect. They are not resulting in affordable housing. So again, there was no requirement for it. There was a thought that it would when it was first developed, when the infill toolkit was first developed. What has actually occurred in practice is that it has not resulted in more affordable housing, even though they are typically smaller units. Again, it's the design that's creating very attractive units and a strong demand for them. The other one is with regard to ADA with accessibility. We did remove the single floor area maximums on those housing types that had them, such as cottage housing, small lot. That was purposely done to create more flexibility for developers to build single living homes with a single floor of living. And then as far as, again, fourplexes and stuff like that, I do believe that if a developer does build those, the requirements, if a unit is entirely built on one level at the ground level, then there are accessibility requirements. If it's a multi-level dwelling unit, then those accessibility requirements go away. Or if it's a apartment building with units on upper floors and there's no elevator access. So again, if you're creating dwelling units that are all on the ground floor with all ground floor living, and it's more than one unit, I believe that there are some accessibility requirements for those.
Okay, any other responses from staff? No. Barbara and then Ollie had their hands up. Go ahead, Barbara.
So I'm wondering if we have the ability to make requirements for affordable housing. You know, if we're just relying on the industry to just create it because it's available, that obviously hasn't worked. So I'm wondering if we have the capability and what those capabilities are in requiring a component of affordability in any structure that's built. My other question is, I hear us talking about addressing architects and landscapers and developers in making these toolkits easier, but we have 93,000 people in this town, and a lot of people are saying that the housing that we've got here isn't working. So again, I ask, can we find ways to make sure that affordability is on the table and that it is available and that it is a part of our toolkit?
So I think what I'd like to do is go around the room one more time, or go around all the hands, and then do a second round with staff responding. That's okay. So Ollie, go ahead.
Yeah, my comments are just specific to the topic that Barbara's talking about and the affordability comments that were made. So I don't know, Scott may have thoughts on that too. If we're all on the same topic, we could get our thoughts out and then circle back.
Yeah, let's do a round of commissioners discussing that, and then we'll go back to staff after that.
Well, just a couple things. I think Chris made a good point about the removal. This is a specific thing, but they've removed the requirement for, there used to be a maximum ground floor. So you might have 1,000 square feet of floor area, but you can only put 600 square feet on the ground floor, forcing you to build a 2-story residence, and it precluded ramblers. So Chris made a good point about that being something that could facilitate greater accessibility and more units. That's a good change from an accessibility standpoint. But more specifically to affordability, I err more toward what Kurt said about this than what Chris said about this, because I think Kurt, you said, you know, it hasn't gotten us there, but it could get us there. And I think that the fact that the infill toolkit homes we've built, most of them have been built since 2015. The fact that they're not affordable has much more to do with our market and the economics of our community than it does with the design or the housing type. Nothing is affordable right now. And to suggest, you know, we can't suggest that like, well, infill toolkit won't result in affordability because it hasn't. I mean, we're in an unprecedented crisis. And so by building smaller and by building more of them, we might see, like Kurt, like you were saying, we might see these start to have some movement on the needle if we make them easy enough to do. And I don't mean sacrificing design, but I think when we talk about this code, how they look isn't as important as whether or not we can do things to make them more affordable, easier to build. And so how they look is important, but not more important. And so that should be our primary focus is that. And I know a lot of these things are about making them fit in character. That's important, but it's not the most important thing. And so I do think, you know, it's weird that this one sentence in the purpose and intent statement is the first thing we've dug into. But I actually think that it's appropriate to leave affordable housing in the purpose and intent, because you have to have aspirations. And if you remove it, you're like abandoning it. And if you leave it in there, you can look back on this later if this starts to work and say, well, this is like one of the comp plan policies that we hoped this would support, and it might drive how we update it. Because if we're thinking about it, about things looking good, then we might pick rules one way. And if we think, oh, one of the intent statements is affordable housing, we might make other choices. So I generally like the idea of putting it back in. And that's my comment on that particular topic.
Yeah.
Back in 2018, DADUs were promised to offer us a form of affordable housing. That was the big argument. And now we're being told it didn't work. That's an infill toolkit choice. It's about supply and demand. And you guys keep promising us that the more supply, the demand will go down and therefore the prices go down. And it's just not going to happen. No possibility of market rate infill toolkits will create anything that is affordable for the person who needs affordability in housing, not housing choice, which is a middle class issue. This is about somebody who otherwise cannot find affordable housing, otherwise they go homeless. And this is a perfect opportunity with infill, these types of housing choices, to create true affordable housing. And whether it's not in this document, I need a promise from the city that we're going to do it sometime soon. And I truly don't think it's going to be market rate. Everyone keeps promising market rate, that we're going to have a capitalistic solution. That's not going to happen when you have an unlimited demand of people coming from California and environmental refugees. You will not decrease demand through supply of housing stock. This has to be done through policy. And the only policy that's at our disposal is inclusionary zoning. And if that doesn't become a huge priority for this city as soon as possible, we're going to be reactionary again and again and again. We're going to be decades in this, and we're going to have a ton of people who still don't have a solution. And it's unacceptable for the city to be sitting on this and not acting. And to say that we have to do it now, when we let thousands of multifamily buildings not get built because we didn't force the density minimums and make sure that that solution wasn't solved decades ago. And now we have to hurry up and do all this type of infill supply just because we're once again reactionary, really frustrates me. It's time for us to actually create housing for those who truly need it, because they will become homeless without it, not because the middle class can't choose a neighborhood to live in that they want to live in and the house that they want to live in. I'm sorry for being so emotional about this, but this has been sitting, and we've been getting promises. The city needs to do something. This document, you can. Once again, we just get spun around.
Go ahead, Jed. Thanks, Scott.
Yeah, I think I don't really have anything that insightful to say in terms of like affordable housing, because I think everyone here is like, we're all pretty frustrated with just kind of the situation that's ongoing, and no one really knows how to fix it. And so I think that's just, in general, my comment would be is, I mean, we have kind of a, we do have a housing crisis, obviously, and now we have, an infill toolkit that I don't know if you even took out some of the embellishments and things like that, requirements for porches and windows on garages and all these little things that they do add cost to construction. But I think that the bigger issue is supply and demand, and we do live in a free market where people are going to try to make money. So it's like these are kind of like contradictory issues to being able to provide affordable housing. So, I mean, I don't have the answer. I wish I did. I wish someone did. I think we need to obviously try as hard as we can to come up with solutions. I don't know that the infill toolkit is going to be a solution, but obviously this is a big deal. Everybody, I think, in the commission agrees that we're in kind of a unprecedented time for Bellingham. And yeah, I'd love to hear,
great ideas. I'll be trying to come up with some myself, and I hope that we can come together and come up with some solutions.
Rose?
Yeah, I don't want to derail the work in front of us too much with the housing affordability topic, because we can talk about this forever. But I do want to just point out the difference. Like when we talk about affordability, there's two types of affordability. There's 80% and below AMI, which is like some people call it the big A affordable. And then there's affordable for what people can buy. And those are two different things. The Whatcom Housing Alliance in May did an event called What is the Missing Middle? It was a really great event. It's recorded and on their website. I encourage everyone to watch it, because it really does a good job of explaining sort of supply, demand, and also the importance of having the missing middle and having those housing choices so that we have more housing. And so it's, for every person that's in an apartment that could be in a missing middle home, that's taking it away from somebody else that could be in that spot. And that sort of, it goes down the line. So Sightline Institute, there's a million organizations doing great research on this in regards to how the missing middle impacts affordability. So I just want to say that I do think that this is one of the important tools that we can use, and the more we can apply it across the city, the better. I will also say that ADUs can be affordable. I live in one. I now have an affordable ADU and I have an affordable house, and I rent them both. Well, I live in one and I rent my house below market rate. And I know there's lots of homeowners that have done the same and would be interested as the ADUs. I know that's coming forward soon to be curious to see just how they're being applied in Bellingham. We did some research a few years ago with the initial ADUs that were done. I think there was only 60 of them done at that time, and most of them were being rented for free to family. And so that is very affordable.
I'll jump in. On the ADA thing, I live in a multi-story building, multi-family building, because daughter is in a wheelchair. And 5 years ago, I looked all around town. There's not a single family home that doesn't have stairs at the front of it. So the building codes can talk about door widths and turn radiuses all they want, but every house has stairs. Stairs aren't accessible. Front porches with stairs are accessible, and nothing we do is going to change. Like, houses got to be raised up off the ground a little bit, water issues and stuff. And so if you live life in a wheelchair, look for those elevators. That's where it's going to work. I mean, bathroom widths and all this stuff is important, and the stuff about the bottom floor, that flexibility is really good. And not every accessibility issue is wheelchair. Some people have different gradients of mobility challenges, and so those things are all really important. Yeah, Rose is right. Like affordability is we could talk about that for nonstop for just weeks on end in one very long Zoom call. But I guess to keep it really brief, if we put strong, whatever, if there's anything we could put about affordability on Infill Toolkit specifically, it's an alternative to other products, and those other products are what will get built. So you'll get, if you put stuff on Infill Toolkit, then you'll just get apartment buildings or single family house. It's just, you won't see Infill Toolkit, and that's not what we're here to try and accomplish. And lots has already been said, but the new things are not what the new product is not affordable. The new iPhone is the most expensive version, but the point of it is to make the old products maybe stay stable in price and not increase drastically. And so sometimes a new Infill Toolkit cluster being built means that something else on another side of town didn't go up in price. And that being part of a system is how we think about making the system have more balance of supply and demand. And it's not necessarily that you can't measure that by looking at one new project that happens to be expensive. It may be helping out in other areas. But Barbara, you had your hand next.
So we have examples all over town of affordable housing being built, and most of them, yes, indeed, are apartment buildings. But we have plenty of examples. So it can be done, and it can be done in this town. And I think I've mentioned this when I first started on the committee, that we're not working with the housing authority. The housing authority has the capability of adding low-income housing to any structure. They don't have to build an entire building. They can build part of a building. And we're not utilizing that. And it's not in the toolkit in any way, shape, or form. And I think that not adding this stuff now, or you know, as you say, derailing this particular meeting, this is the single most important time to be talking about this. I mean, when are we going to add this in if we don't add it in now? If we don't talk about it now, when?
Thanks, Barbara. Scott?
Thank you, Barbara, for bringing that up. One thing that I found to be a challenge, and maybe there's historical precedence on this, Greg, that we get an end complete document instead of being able to be a part of the original thought process. And maybe if we had been able to be a part of that, we could have flushed some of this out. But getting to the document, since I derailed some of it already, I didn't understand what open space and usable space was. And I'm concerned that folks who live in these homes, there is a lot of maximization in comparison to lot size of the useful space. But is there enough space outside? Is there enough space for them to feel like they live in a home instead of an apartment, I guess you could say. And I don't understand how the open space and the useful space creates that sense in how the building is used.
Ollie?
Well, that was a new question. I'd be okay if staff wanted to respond to Scott's question. I was going to make a comment on the affordability discussion, but
sorry.
No, it's okay.
No,
it's hard to tell. In Zoom environment's hard.
Yeah, no, we're doing all commissioners, and staff's keeping a list. So Scott, that was great. Ollie, you can go back to you can add to the affordability, but we'll take a break in just a second, and staff's going to do a round.
Okay, I just want to circle back to all the comments because I think I tend to agree with Mike, you and Rose a little bit in that we're looking at, like, the toolkit is just a housing form, and it could have broad impact, you know, all over. It's not a vehicle in and of itself to create affordability. And while I want to have those crazy conversations that we're all going to have, that Barbara and Scott have talked about how we deal with this crisis, you know, and how we provide the subsidy that's necessary to accomplish true affordability, because it can't be accomplished without some kind of subsidy. That needs to be done, in my opinion, in the context of all of our housing. We can't go and be like, we're going to apply it here, we're going to apply it here. Let's have the big conversation in this context, because like Mike said, if we do that, that'll just go by the wayside because people will choose not to do it. So it has to be talked about as like a holistic thing. And I'm excited to have that conversation one day in our community, but it just, in my opinion, it just can't be the conversation about this code. We're trying to make this easier to use. That would definitely not make it easier to use. Let's have that conversation about how we take steps to provide the necessary subsidies across the board. Apartments, new single family neighborhoods, infill toolkit, whatever that is, all of them. That's just my take on that. And so I think when I brought up the language, all I'm suggesting is that there's no reason to take out the sentence in 2028-010A that says, and creating opportunities for more affordable housing, because why not have that in there? Because it's something this could help with. So for me, that's all I would like to see happen here tonight and next week, or in 2 weeks, as we talk about the toolkit itself.
Thanks, Ollie. Jed?
Yeah, I think, you know, the idea of the ADUs is definitely, I mean, it's a good thing. And I do appreciate the fact that the ADUs don't count towards the floor area ratio. I think that's a good thing. Lets you add a a unit, you know, on a lot that you wouldn't be able to otherwise. You know, feel like I'm playing catch up sometimes and kind of like educating myself into, you know, kind of the history of what's been going on in this area, and in terms of, you know, kind of like, you know, just basically, yeah, kind of the history of where we're at now based on where we came from. One thing I've kind of been curious with is, like, you know, there's so much resistance in this, I don't know, just in the zoning world in general to, like, you know, if you have 2 kitchens in a house, it's almost like you're breaking some kind of, like, you know, some kind of holy rule or something. And it's like, you know, I moved up here with my wife's parents, you know, big family. We all moved at the same time. And it's like, you know, our goal is to build a structure that has, you know, space for aging relatives. You know, it'd be great if my kids can't afford to live here, if they had some privacy in a home. And it's like, why can't we look at having some opportunities to have, you know, more than one dwelling unit within a dwelling unit? I mean, I think that we're kind of like, you know, I lived in France for a semester on a study abroad, and I lived in someone's attic space that had a kitchen and a little bedroom, and it was great. You know, it's like, I didn't feel like I was destroying a neighborhood or anything like that. So, I mean, in some ways, I think that we've kind of got these antiquated ideas of, like, you know, by God, we can't have 2 kitchens in a house. You know, we're going to ruin the single family residential mold. And it's like, we're already talking about, you know, these infill toolkit type of setups that are different. They're, you know, predominantly in multifamily zones and other zones that aren't single family. So I don't know. I just think, you know, whatever we can do to possibly allow more people to live, you know, even if it's multi-generational, I think that's a big step right there. You know, I mean, it could save families money if they have an apartment for a kid or an aging relative in a house, and allow them to kind of live that, you know, have some independence. So I think that's maybe something that we could look at. I don't know if it's appropriate for this, but, you know, it's just a general thought.
Yeah, thanks, Jed. Okay. Seeing a pause, why don't we turn it back over to staff for responses to any new issues or more in-depth conversations we just had?
I can start, Mike, and then I'll ask staff if they have anything else. I wanted to address the inclusionary zoning comments that came up. We looked at inclusionary zoning in the city 7 or 8 years ago and found that our market wasn't ready for it. Council has put money in our budget for next year to get some consultant help and look at the inclusionary zoning, a potential inclusionary zoning program again. There are lots of issues with inclusionary zoning, and there are only certain places where it works. And so we need to figure out with some help whether or not it'll work in Bellingham. But it will be a big change if we start requiring property owners and developers to include affordable units in their projects. And there are lots of issues around that, and we're going to have that discussion. And so I just wanted to clarify that. The other thing I would say about the question of ADUs and affordability, there may have been folks who said ADUs would help with affordability. I can tell you staff was not one of them that ever said that. We never sold detached ADUs to the community as an affordable option. We thought they might help, and in certain circumstances, I think they have. But neither ADUs nor the infill toolkit nor any of the other things that we're doing are going to have a major impact on affordability. I agree with Rose's comments that affordable housing will need to be subsidized housing. There are limits to what a small local jurisdiction can do in terms of impacting affordability. So we will be looking at inclusionary zoning. It's not a slam dunk. There are lots of issues with it, but we'll be having that conversation with the community and with the Planning Commission next year.
And I think the only thing that I would add to that is that we do believe that supply can help with affordability. That doesn't mean that everyone will be able to afford a house in this market, because there's so many other factors that come onto it. We do care about affordability, and we have been working on projects to somewhat help affordability from the limited scope that city government can. We have a substantial program in place that helps take state money, federal money, and we are, we are working with affordable housing groups to ensure that true affordable housing is being built. And that's the big A that's out there, the big A, affordable housing. So I think that the fact that our community taxes itself through the levy, the home levy fund, that's something that we have been doing. Our community is very concerned about affordability, and it's something that we have been trying to address the ways that local government can for a while now. And the infill toolkit, and having more housing choice out there, having more housing supply, which a lot of our rules have attempted to do, can potentially have an impact on that. There's no guarantee that the market we can change all the rules and regulations that we want. We can give away permits, but there's no guarantee that that savings will be passed on to the purchaser, the homeowner purchaser. And that's a struggle. That's a very hard thing for us to comprehend. And we're trying to find ways that the government can control that, or at least help with that. And by making sure that we've got adequate amounts of land to do that, making sure that we've got efficient permitting processes and rules and regulations in place can help do that. Ensuring that we've got rules that support the creation of missing middle housing forms can help with that. So the toolkit in itself is not the silver bullet. There is no silver bullet when it comes to affordability. It's a multi-pronged approach, and it's not just an issue in Bellingham. It's an issue in the state. It's an issue in our nation, and it's something that we all have to work together to try and find ways to make this work. And it's going to take us looking at different zoning rules and regulations. There's a lot of work that's going to be happening at the state legislature this next session. There'll be a lot of bills that are going to come in that are going to continue to try and address that. So I think all that we have been doing, and I sit back and I look at just the work that this planning commission has done, I believe we are making a dent and an impact on it. And I do think that the more that we can do, the better. And having that work on the inclusionary zoning is going to be very, very important work that is on our work program, as Greg mentioned. So it's not that we are not looking at it. It's not that we're not addressing it. It's something that we do believe in. We have been working on it. You're seeing slices of things. And in the whole, I think we've made quite a bit of progress. We need to do more, and we will continue to do more on that. So like Greg mentioned, we look forward to having that robust discussion with our community about inclusionary zoning in the coming year.
I think I just want to end with the infill toolkit is working, and it has worked. And when I tally the storybook page that is online right now, we have over 700 units that are either completed and or in application or in pre-app. That means people are wanting to use it. And right now they're smaller scale. So to get that many units, we're roughly at about 40 applications, maybe 50 applications. So the infill is truly working. And the RM project, we need to be ready for the consequences of how we are going to assist our landowners to provide their minimum densities. And we need to find help. We need to help them find ways, alternative choices through a streamlined process, because the quicker that we can do that, the quicker that we can get things online, and the quicker we can have a stronger demand. And I just believe that we need to We need to fix certain elements of something that's working. And it kind of goes back to Kurt's intro. It needs an oil change. We don't need a brand new engine. And we've just got to figure out what that perfect balance is. And staff believes that we've made a pretty good attempt to provide that balance that will assist us in the future, providing those missing middle housing choices.
Okay, thanks for all those responses. It's 8:45. We've done a good amount of high-level conversations. Didn't solve our housing crisis quite yet. What? I don't know. Do we want to jump in and try and do a half an hour or so of detailed work, starting on a page and just working down, or are there any other kind of big picture stuff we want to get out to staff for them to come back to us with in 2 weeks? Holly?
I personally am okay digging in and think we should start at the beginning if we do that, because like each section has unique things. Some of them might not generate any discussion. That's just my opinion. I thought that was a fun, robust discussion about the big picture.
Yeah. So if we're going to go section by section, and I'm thinking of you specifically, Ollie, do we want to get into like detailed things about line items, like should this number be a 0.6? Should this number be a 0.7? Or do we want to get into kind of medium level in each section to kind of get staff an idea of, what do you think?
Are you asking me because you're worried I'm going to get into that level of detail?
Just based on prior experience.
Yeah, no, I mean, I personally don't feel like that I need to do that. I don't know. In the past, when we've worked on these big, like ADUs or whatever, it's been nice to dig into it a little bit, because the next meeting will be a work session where we can kind of work through some of the things that get unresolved, but sometimes those can take a while. So making some progress on, individual sections and not trying to wordsmith the entire thing seems to be like down to the nitty gritty seems like a good approach to me. But we're a group, I feel like I'm not the only say by any means.
No, I agree. I'm thinking about what I think would be great is to get through a medium level, and because it stirs up a lot of it. It helps you think about the whole thing, and it stirs up more ideas that can come back at the next round. Jed, you have a hand up? You're on mute.
Yeah, I didn't mean to have my hand up. My keyboard's getting a little crazy. Sorry.
Okay. Let's start and go in order, and we'll see when we need to take a break or take a pause.
If I could, sorry, excuse me, if I could just 1 minute. I think one of the things that we may run into is if you want to go by section by section, I think what we're going to end up doing is because the way that the code is laid out and the way that the ordinance is laid out is that section 1 may include items that are in section 10. It's more like the topic areas. So like a perfect example is section 2 of the ordinance talks about green factor. Well, that's like one line item in one section of the code. And that green factor is actually talked about in multiple sections and multiple areas of our code. So if we go through this one at a time, I think it's going to be challenging because you're talking about section 1 and section 3 and section 18 all at the same time with this topic. So trying to go through that may make it somewhat challenging. With our presentation, we attempted to kind of show the big topics, which we believe were out there. We had an idea or a section on just kind of that purpose, the section on the mass and bulking, which includes the floor area ratio, which includes the height discussion. We had a section on green factor, and it may behoove us to try and identify those kind of big topic areas, and then show you where it is in the code.
There's the menu of key issues matrix at the back, and that might be a helpful way to start that conversation. Page 62.
Yeah, I forgot about that. Oh yeah, that's a great point, Kurt. I was scrolling through it and you're right. It's track changes is going to be kind of hard to review if we're aiming for a medium level. Do we want to go through the slides again and then come back and go through this key issues, and that maybe would cover?
It might help us if we bring up the key issues so that everyone can kind of see that matrix, and then identify those issues, and then maybe we can walk through some of those tonight, or make sure that we address those in more detail at our work session. Would that be helpful?
Yes.
Kathy, can you bring that matrix up?
So you want the menu of key issues? Is that what you're talking about?
Correct.
Yeah.
Okay. And now I need to move you guys somehow from this. There.
That's great. Okay, pedestrian orientation is the first one. We saw some great graphics illustrating, not this, but this. Could you walk us through a little bit more of like what the teeth are in terms of accomplishing that? Like beyond, like the vision was clear from the slides, but what are some of the specific points that would yield better pedestrian orientation?
So I can speak to that issue there. So with pedestrian oriented design, again, we spoke earlier that it really is a matter of how you design a project to interface with the street so that you have very prominent pedestrian oriented features that are human scale, such as the front porch. The entry is clear and obvious. You have windows, architecture, enhanced architecture. The windows help a building relate to the street, both for the people that live in the building and also to those that are out on the street, pedestrians. They provide eyes on the street, which provides for a sense of security. So there's a number of details. If garages are fronting on the street, then they should be set back from the front face of the building so that they aren't as prominent. They need to be designed to be there so that their presence is minimized. So all of that, those are all techniques for creating pedestrian-oriented design. The other kind of the new feature is the allowance for the common pedestrian corridor. So currently infill development is required to front on either a street or a lane. And when a lane is used, all the design requirements for fronting a street are required for that building when the development is fronting on a lane. So now taking it to the next level, when a common pedestrian corridor is implemented, the same applies, that now development would front on the common pedestrian corridor. All those design features for pedestrian oriented design must be implemented to satisfy that provision. There is a minimum width of 10 feet for that pedestrian corridor. all the setbacks and design requirements from what would otherwise be required of a street or lane also apply to that pedestrian corridor.
So if we can draw your attention specifically to page 9 of the packet, section 8, which starts on line 13. That begins our key elements to define specific design standards and guidelines that should be incorporated into projects to be pedestrian oriented. So not only do we have the purpose and intent statement, but we also have these others. So we talk about fronting the units on the street. We talk about where the parking shouldn't be a dominant site planning feature, and try to tuck it behind the alley. And if you can't, then we go on to state that there's certain parameters of what you should do from those design considerations. So that's the actual code of where we're trying to take what that purpose and intent is, and this is how we would implement that purpose and intent. And as you go deeper into some of the housing choices or some of the housing types, as well as some of the parking, it will get into further detail. But generally speaking, we're trying to put the mass on this facing street. We're trying to humanize our pedestrian ways, and simply where that is not possible and you can't have alley access, then we've incorporated some design standards and guidelines to address those situations, because we realize not every neighborhood either A, has an alley, or the topography, or there's going to be some other situation where we cannot have an alley in every single situation. So there are alternatives, and those are what we're trying to provide in section 8 and those code sections.
Discussion on pedestrian orientation. Scott, I saw you had a hand up.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
does it have, are the pedestrian orientation issues that you were trying to deal with here, have they been one of the challenges that have made the infill toolkits difficult to make popular with developers? Or is this kind of a separate issue that is something that you've come across that needs to be fixed?
I would say, as we put into our introductory statements, the existing infill toolkit has prescriptive standards that would suggest this is what we would achieve, but this is not what we're achieving. And so what we have done to achieve this is process a lot of modifications to allow good pedestrian oriented design, and basically resulting in pedestrian corridors. So the very thing that we've been doing for workarounds, we've actually now formulated and put it into code so that we can continue to implement the good things that we're seeing out in our existing developments.
And do most of the developments that have infill toolkits with pedestrian orientation, do they have sidewalks to the left and right of those new infills so that the pedestrian can continue walking past the beautiful sidewalk that's been created?
Typically you don't have a sidewalk next to a sidewalk, right? Or you don't have a pedestrian corridor next to a sidewalk, because what we would do is try to provide the building with that orientation on a public sidewalk. Is when you start to face internally, it's another means of providing a private pedestrian means of access through the site, and it just kind of creates that community. So it has really been, it's been really helpful, and is actually in some ways gives the opportunity to provide those pedestrian corridors in lieu of streets that have sidewalks. So again, it's another design strategy that we've been able to implement in some of our infill housing projects.
Yeah, and I'd add that we've had a mix where, take for example, the development out on Mahogany. Depending on the context, the housing that's at the edge, such as the ones that front on the storm facility that wetland created out there, there's a walkway just on one side, where there's houses only on one side of that walkway because the storm is on the other side. So those have front porches that have direct access to the walkway, direct access to the regional pedestrian corridor, and overlook that wetland, which is very nice. And then internal to the project, you have common walkways that are accessed from both sides of the walkway.
Scott, were you maybe asking about a street that doesn't have a sidewalk at all and a new development comes in, maybe 3 or 4 units, and they're required to put a sidewalk in front of those brand new units, but then the sidewalk just sort of terminates?
Oh, you're on mute, Scott.
Thank you. The pictures had a sidewalk that continue for multiple properties. And I'm just wondering if it will work as well as we want it to, if those sidewalks don't continue onto the properties left and right of the new infill.
Oh, I understand what you're saying. It really depends on the context. So in some circumstances, those pedestrian walkways will be through an entire block, which is exactly what I think you're suggesting. Sometimes they are meant to provide access from an alley to a fronting street. Sometimes they just provide access from individual units to the street. So it really depends on the context and the housing type that is chosen. And there's really a lot of variation. That's why this code was written the way it is, to not be so prescriptive, because there are so many ways to get at the intent of what we're trying to achieve.
Great, thank you.
Ollie?
Hey, thanks. So I understand the intent of this, because what we've seen in a lot of the infill toolkit developments is a single access road with housing on either side of it, and garages and front entries facing that access road. And so you create an inherent conflict between the front of the home and the access for the vehicles into the garages. I understand that the common pedestrian corridor idea is to separate those two things so that you have the homes and the pedestrian access kind of separate and not in conflict with the vehicular access. So I get it. It makes a lot of sense. And I think a lot of these specific standards accomplish that. You know, comments about orienting the project to the existing street. There's a couple locations in here. I understand the intent behind that. I wonder if we should change that language a little bit. This is maybe for Chris, because a lot of the sites, most of the development occurring, the site's like deeper than it is wide. So most of the development that's occurring is behind the street. And so maybe there's a way to change that to imply that the units in the project that are adjacent to the street should be oriented to the existing street. Because that's really what you're trying to accomplish with those standards, is to get the units up front to orient. Most of our projects by necessity, they have a lane that comes into the site, unless it's a very small site, right? So once you're in, I get what this is trying to accomplish. And my primary comment would be, I think we should define alley. That's another suggestion I have, because pedestrian corridor and lane are both defined terms and alley is not. And really the alley is different and intended for a different purpose. And we have a lot of references in here where things apply to streets and lanes and ped corridors, but not to alleys. And to accomplish what you're trying to get at, which is separating those ped facilities, orienting the developments communally more, and getting the access in the back, you're making it back of house, we're calling it. I liked the comment, using that comment, it was in one of the public comments, because it's like, you know, the alley is just like the alley in my neighborhood in Columbia, a lovely single family neighborhood. It's to get things that you don't want seen and to get the vehicle access and focus everybody the other way. And so I think it'd be important to define that, because what we don't want to do is overburden the design of the alley. The alley should be like the minimum. It should just be, you know, it doesn't need a ped facility necessarily. I noticed there's some requirements for landscaping to separate units, and I like that it's not prescriptive. So people can be creative about how they do that. It doesn't say you need this much width or that much, but I think this needs language that more clearly identifies the purpose of the alley, so that we don't end up building orienting projects to a common pedestrian facility and then also being obligated to build a really pretty fancy lane for our cars to get to our garages. Because then we're doubling up. And one of the problems we've encountered in my experience implementing the toolkit is that we get squeezed on space with all these things. And so getting doubled up on that would be, it wouldn't fix the problem that we're encountering. So just a couple comments on that topic. I think coming back with a definition for an alley that clearly implies the intent is, you know, the back, and making sure that then we don't, I guess that will help when future planners and future developers and future owners try to implement this in understanding what we're trying to accomplish with the pedestrian corridors. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, and I would just add that the definitions that are in the infill housing toolkit at the beginning are just new definitions that really apply to the infill toolkit and don't apply elsewhere in the land use code, Title 20. The definitions chapter for Title 20, that's 2008, that does include a definition for alley. And so we don't want to repeat definitions that are already used in the land use ordinance. So I think what I'm hearing from you is we need clarification of the purpose of an alley in the context of infill housing.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. That's a really good point. And I don't like creating duplicity. So yeah, it's more about language that implies that intent that, you know, by orient, like if you choose to do an infill toolkit project and you're going to go, you want us to put orient into a pedestrian facility, then the alley becomes like the back of house, so that people know that they don't have to, you know, meet lane standards, for example. This is spread throughout, and I just think it'd be important to have a statement that captures that intent better, because then you hit this concept throughout the document.
And Ollie, I totally agree with you, because the definition, what we have talked about in just all the years of doing this is alleys usually refer to public spaces, and they may not be public spaces in this particular case. And that's one of the things that the current definition is really more specific to public. So your point is very well taken, that we are defining a new type of alley, and it's really meant for public, I mean, for private, and there's different ways of going about the same thing. So I think your point is well taken. It's something that we can definitely work on.
I don't know what that language should be. Thanks, Kathy, but yeah, the idea. So thank you.
Yep.
Jed, you're up next.
Yeah, it's just, you know, I feel like that there's a push for having the residential units to face the existing streets, you know, so there's like a hierarchy where like the existing street is kind of the most important, and prioritizing the orientation to that. I'm just wondering if there's, you know, consideration of certain streets or zoning or different areas, and just kind of like uses where they may not be as appropriate for kind of like the scale of this type of infill housing. You know, maybe it's an industrial or more commercial zone. And then you have kind of like this smaller scale form that maybe a priority would be to create more of the orientation to something more internal to the development as opposed to the existing street. And just with how this is written, that there's really, you know, kind of like it's just a black and white, like, you know, you're prioritizing this existing street kind of over these other lesser important orientations. So I'm just kind of wondering if there, you know, like, is the way that it's worded making it so rigid that there's not the ability for, you know, kind of like nuance to what maybe the existing context is.
Yeah, again, it was in the PowerPoint there, and there's a lot of information there, but the primary intent is that the city's street network is the city's primary mode for vehicular and pedestrian transportation. And so we want to support that as a pedestrian facility first, before turning your back with other designs that would internalize a development. Really, the first intent is to face the street not turn your back or your side to the street, and support the street network as the primary pedestrian network, because ultimately, as a pedestrian leaves the development, the site, they are going to have to walk on the city's street network. And so we want the city street network to be as attractive and inviting as possible.
Okay.
And I would just add for Ollie's comment about the one provision in there in section 8 about the street being the prioritized frontage for fronting units on. That's not to say that you can't additionally front units on a internal lane or pedestrian corridor. It's just the street should be maximized first, and then if you have more density, then those units can be placed on the internal circulation network. But I think that potentially we could add a sentence here to clarify that.
And
So
there's minor modifications for, like, if I'm thinking about Telegraph townhomes, and they're on Telegraph, which is not exactly your sort of the pedestrian travel lane that you would think about facing. You might want your house to be facing on versus maybe more internally on that project, for example. And are there going to be opportunities for minor modifications on things like that, where if the arterial is very busy and there's big trucks going through, that it might not be the one that you want to face?
Basically, there's opportunities for minor modifications, and if you can provide a design that satisfies the purpose and intent, in keeping with the minor modification allowance, there's flexibility.
And I think Rose, what I would add to that is, when you look at Telegraph, just to use it as an example, 10 years ago, you would never think that you would see a person ever out walking on a sidewalk because there wasn't a sidewalk out there. But now that we have all the development that we have out there, and we've brought the density and we've brought the buildings to the street and the orientation to the street, you actually will see people out there walking. So the only way that you're going to create these, while it may not be ideal when you're doing it, in time it will be. And that's what we have to continue to think about, is it's not for what the situation exists today, is what is it going to be in 10, 15, 20, 30, 50, 100 years. That's what we're building is for tomorrow, not necessarily for what's today. And we do struggle with that. And we do have a lot of conversation with applicants about that very topic.
Anything else on pedestrian orientation?
Mike, I was thinking about what I said to Chris. Chris, a spot to maybe look to try and bring across that alley intent, it would be in section G. In the pedestrian, private lanes, common pedestrian corridors, and alley section, the first few items kind of define like the intent of a lane and a ped facility, and maybe it's worth adding another bullet to define the alley intent. Just thinking about where it fits in. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, let's move into the next section, development standards. I was wondering if there's any opportunity here for, like we did with the RM review, to look at a couple more, maybe even like semi-real world examples of a lot, different common lot sizes, common FAR, open space, et cetera, for the different, like then there's the mix of housing types. What kind of possibilities are opened up by the proposed changes to the numbers. And, just a couple series of lot diagrams would be like really helpful for everyone to look at.
Scott, earlier you had a question about what is, the difference between open space and usable space. Really, open space is the area on property that's not encumbered by building and impervious surface. So really it's the area that can be landscaped, or it's the area that you can cover with pervious surfaces such as a open deck, a pavered patio, pervious concrete. So in some cases, in order to incentivize low impact development, they will allow pervious concrete for driveways. It also allows for green roofs. So that is what open space is. Usable space is the area that is designated for use by the occupants to be a functional, usable space, which is typically outdoor when it's associated with individual dwelling units, has minimum dimensions of 4 by 10. That's typically a minimum a deck or patio or something like that, or when it's provided in common for a number of units to share, that usable space, the minimum dimension is 20 by 20. And so, whatever the number of units are, if their usable space is combined, then that potentially would grow. But the minimum dimension would be 20 feet on any one side. So it could be 20 by 40 feet or 20 by 50 feet.
Thank you, Chris. And in regards to that, was most of the numbers for open and usable space were reduced in these housing types? Is that correct?
I believe for open space they were, and for usable space, in some cases, there was conflicts in the code of how they were identified. In some places they were identified as usable open space. And so we tried to unify the terminology on either it's open space or usable space, for one thing. But yes, in some cases, the open space is reduced because we are finding that in order to build a building, take for example, the provision that requires that limited the floor area on any one floor, which would force a building into a two-story building. If you want to put all that on one floor and build for senior living and for ADA accessibility and such, you couldn't build all the floor area on one floor and satisfy the open space requirement. So the open space in many cases was restricting which you could build on the lot. You couldn't build everything on a single floor as a rambler. So really, by reducing the open space, it creates more opportunities, more flexibility on the housing that you can build. And also it makes the housing more competitive, because for other housing types, such as multifamily and single family, I think the open space requirement is only like 25 or 35%. And so when the infill housing was 60%, that's a huge disincentive to using the infill toolkit compared to other just standard housing forms such as single family and multifamily. So we're trying to make, as Ali said, the infill toolkit more competitive with the other housing that's allowed out there.
Jump right in.
These housing type by housing type development standards are the single most impactful thing on people being able to use the toolkit. Like in my experience, and I've worked with the toolkit quite a bit in the past 10 years, and as Chris said, they're all important components of a design, but we had 150% in 100%. We had 10 pounds in a 5-pound bag. I remember one of the planners said that to me. We came in with a permit and it was like our 4th permit. And the planner said, it feels like you're trying to pack 10 pounds in a 5-pound bag. And I said, that's because we are, because the code requires us to pack 10 pounds in a 5-pound bag. We can't fit 60% open space and 0.6 green factor and this floor area ratio and parking and all this on a site. It just can't fit. And so this is where most of the modifications, I feel like, and like difficulties with massing in my experience have come from. And so I'm really supportive of all these changes because I think they'll actually make it function a lot better for like, for example, most of the homes we've seen are townhouse because the townhouse is the most flexible amongst these. And it didn't have an open space requirement at all. And it had the greatest floor area ratio. And so people gravitated toward it. So this to me like levels the playing field between the various housing types that are proposed. My question is why I like the uniformity, for example, front porch uniformity, the ability to average that front porch to create flexibility is a great idea. Those are like things that where you made that uniform throughout all the forms. My question is, why are there differences in the different housing forms between open space, green factor, usable space requirements, things like that? This question for staff is like, you balance it out better, but you still have differences for each form. Why is that? Why did you end up on that conclusion?
I can answer that. So one of the reasons is for example, cottage housing, which is a form based on houses arranged around a central common open space. That is inherently results in more open space than say townhouse, which has a higher green floor area ratio, taller height limits, isn't reliant on a open space, being centered around an open space. A townhouse is more typically fronting on a street and maybe has a deck for their usable space. Townhouses are more typical of a lifestyle that is for someone that doesn't want to maintain a yard. And so that's why townhouse has a lower green factor than the cottage housing, because cottage housing is inherently greener. It's designed to be around a common open space. So same thing with the open space itself. I think there's a difference between the townhouse and cottage housing. And there's subtle differences between the other housing types, the garden court housing. It's basically the same thing as cottage housing, except that allows for units to be attached. So you get some combination of detached units and attached units, still arranged around a common green. The shared court is actually a housing form arranged around an auto court. And so there is not as much opportunity for landscaping when you have a courtyard that is the kind of like the driveway to all of the units and the garages. But with that one, instead of being landscaped, it is intended to be treated with a paving pattern to make it look more like a plaza or courtyard. So it becomes a functional, usable space when the cars, aren't occasionally using it. And it's rare that the cars are pulling in and out of the garages. It actually is a pretty good situation. We haven't had any of those developed yet, but I've seen those in other communities. So that's part of the reason for the differences in the green factor in the open space and such as that. They are truly different housing types that warrant different different requirements for those, for open space, green factor, and usable space.
How does that affect the runoff and things like that? I mean, there's an environmental impact with that kind of a development, right?
There is, but that's not addressed by the infill toolkit. That's the stormwater runoff is addressed by other city regulations that are specifically tailored to address that.
So does this kind of a structure run up against those regulations?
All development runs up against those regulations. I'd say that one thing with the infill toolkit is the green factor. It does incentivize utilizing low impact development techniques such as permeable paving and pavers, and also retention of existing vegetation of significance. So you do get credit when you can preserve significant trees on site. So there are advantages to using the infill toolkit and use of the green factor. I should say there's advantages environmentally for using infill toolkit with the green factor.
Ollie?
There's a base FAR for each unit, and then in each housing form, for each housing form, and then there's also some exemptions. So with a small house or a cottage, there's an exemption from the FAR for, say, the garages. And in practice, if you build a duplex using this code with a garage or a townhouse, the garage spaces, they're typically attached in that situation. The garage space is exempted from the FAR. That's not explicitly listed. It wasn't before, and in practice, that's how it was applied. Would it warrant maybe in those two forms, making it more explicit that the garages are exempt from FAR, like you do in small house and cottage, for example, since that's how it's being put into practice?
Yeah, in it's actually just the small house that you get or it's small lot now.
Yeah.
To get that exemption for the garage. All other housing forms use the standard definition of floor area ratio, and it's in the definition of floor area ratio that it exempts garages.
Gotcha. That's where you catch it.
Yep.
Thank you. One other comment, and then I'll cede the floor. Is in the small lot, you guys punish people who front load garages by saying that street front loaded garages are included in FAR, garages accessed from an alley or side from the street are exempt from FAR, which is a pretty explicit attempt to discourage garages accessing the lane. We have other design standards that encourage people not to access directly off the street. I feel like this isn't fair. You have developed, like, let's say you own a small lot in an infill neighborhood and there's no alley because the lots were platted without alleys, like many of our neighborhoods. So you get punished for that, and you do a nice design with your garage setback 4 feet like you're supposed to, or a tandem one stall with a garage behind it like the code permits, but yet you have to count that garage into your FAR. I would encourage you to reconsider that section and not punish people who have front loaded garages, because a lot of people can't choose and they have to. And there's other things in this code that are design related that reduce the massing of that garage when it is lane loaded or front loaded, that I think adequately address the concern, which is design, snout nose garages and things like that. The 12-foot driveway width, for example, things like that. So I would encourage you to consider removing that restriction, because I think it unnecessarily punishes like a certain type of lot. That's that's a comment I noted when I first read through it.
So Ollie, just to build off that a little bit, the existing code right now allows for small and smaller, it has a standard FAR, and then it says attached garages are included in the FAR. Detached garages up to 220 square feet are exempt from FAR. So we're not changing the code from that perspective. What we're doing is we're adding a further incentive of 280 square feet for a 2-car detached garage. So we're not taking something away that didn't already exist. So I think so we're not punishing. I know you use that word in a kind of a slang term, I hope, but we're not punishing, we're trying to give an incentive. So I think what you're trying to also suggest is, are there other incentives through good design where maybe we could allow some of the garage space to not count? I mean, are there other ways of not having that garage space count? So the point I'm wanting to make is that we didn't change that. We're adding in an additional incentive. So there's no punishment. We were trying to go the opposite and give reward.
You
all
are
about positive behavior and reward here.
Yes, no, I agree. Your reward, it's an improvement in the code in the sense that you've made it so it doesn't matter if it's attached or detached, which is great because that was also a very limiting thing. So I agree with that. And you've increased the allowance so that people could fit more garage, which is great in this climate. You know, I'm just saying that once you've provided that, you're discriminating. You're only allocating that benefit to a certain type of lot, not all lots. And so that's punishing that certain type of lot is what I mean. You're withholding that benefit from certain lot types. And I think you don't need to do that. I think you could just strike the sentence street front loaded garages are included in FAR. It could just say garages in general garages in general are exempt from FAR as follows, and give that to everybody. That's all. So you're right. You're not taking anything away. I just don't think you're adding enough. How about that?
Yeah. I was wondering that when you take everything into consideration, the FAR, the open space, the usable space, and the minimum floor area, is there any housing type or is there any modification in this specific document that allows for increased unit quantity on a property?
No.
No.
I'm not saying it's good or bad, it just would be nice to know.
No, this is a set of development regulations. And so density is established in our zoning tables. And there are further opportunities to get density bonuses, but those are not specifically associated with the infill toolkit. They work with it, but this itself does not do that.
Gotcha.
Any other discussion on development standards? Okay, 9:30. We spent a bit of time on the first two. Do we want to keep going until 10 and try and cover the 3 remaining on this slide?
Are you asking staff, Mike, or are you asking the
I'm
commission?
asking if anyone has opposition to that idea.
It seems like at least the second two are maybe faster conversations.
So I was hoping.
I don't know that that's true, but I think so.
Okay, I say let's keep going, at least on to the next one, and we'll see when we switch between sections, if we want to make a call to break at some point. So green factor.
Okay, if we would like to go to, first of all, every housing type has now has a green factor requirement, where before small and smaller house did not, but we are recommending that a green factor be placed on the single family. And the main change really is how we calculate green factor. And I am looking for that code section so I can get you to the ordinance on the right page. So the issues that we've had with green factor is really how it works together with the other code standards. And so if you go to page, actually, I will just, I'll pull it over here so that we can have it. It's really a matter of how it works with other codes. So inherently within the green factor score sheet, so what you do is you take your total site area and you get certain credit, or there's certain values for each type of landscaping you do. So preservation, you get points. Big trees, you get big points. Little shrubs, maybe not so much. That's why you put a lot of little shrubs in. So there's just this formula that you end up with a number, and that's what we call your green factor landscape score that all the developments have to do. How you achieve that, there is no set way of achieving that. Every site is different, every landscape plan is different, every objective goal, everything is different. So what our concern has been is the high preservation value, and this is what I spoke about in the presentation, is the high preservation value when you have a really pristine wetland that has a lot of high value. Well, the codes are already requiring that to be preserved. And it could be the situation where you get so much value for that, that the actual landscaping on the developable part is very minimal. So there's kind of a disconnect, there's an imbalance there. So how we've chosen to deal with that, which is not necessarily great either, is we have determined the green factor score based upon the other site, on the entire site. So I give this really, it's kind of what Ali talked about of, fitting 10 pounds in a 5-pound bag. So basically what we're doing is we're taking a green factor score or a certain amount of landscaping that should be applied over the entire site. But if you have critical areas, all of a sudden now you're taking the same amount of landscaping and you're putting it on a much smaller site. The densities are too great, it's too much. And so we've heard from many people saying your green factor scores are too high. And we need to look at this balance. And it's this balance of how much infrastructure do you put on the lot, buildings, parking, etc., how much open space to how much green factor. So there's this balance. And so what we've determined, if you recall back from the RM discussion, we were trying to figure out, do we do density on net or gross of the land? And we decided to take it on gross because it was going to be very difficult to look at all the different challenges of how to define what net is, right? And so we want to go back to that RM and we want to come to the Planning Commission and say, we think the green factor should be built or should be determined on the net buildable area. Or then put it another way, the portion of a site that is actually being developed or built. And what we've done is we've excluded all regulated critical areas that are not proposed to be impacted from the green factor score. So basically, if you've got a 5-acre site and 3 acres of that is wetland, we're going to apply that green factor score to the 2 acres. We're not going to apply it to the 5 acres and then try to fit all that landscaping on 2 acres. So we think it's a better balance and it's a better representation. And what we've also seen is projects that don't have critical areas, which are very far and few between, but those that don't, the green factor scores are working in some cases and they were still a little too high in other places. And again, that's the nexus of really trying to balance everything. So what we did is we we did two things with the green factor. We changed how we measure it, which is the change in section 2. But then we've also looked at some of the housing types and we've tried to readjust those. So they seem to work better. And that's what we were trying to do, is again, provide that balance. Is that helpful?
Yes, that was very helpful. Thoughts on green factor?
Does that
Rose?
include when you talk about the critical areas, if there is mitigation, does it include the buffers
So
or setbacks?
So our practice has been, you can't double dip. So if you're required, if you impact the buffer and you have to do mitigation, then what we have said is you're doing mitigation not to meet the green factor, you're doing mitigation for your impact. And then you should be doing green factor on top of that. And so what this would say is that it would again separate it, right? So whatever mitigation you're doing would occur within the critical area. And then anything outside of that is where you're going to provide your landscaping or your green factor. Did that answer your question? Okay.
Jump right in.
I guess my question is, have you guys truth tested this change in calculation with any people who implement the green factor, like the landscape architects? Because it sounds like a good shift in the way the calculation is made. But I just want to make sure that all of us lay people who don't have to do the calcs and design the landscape plans aren't making decisions for the people who actually have to do it. I guess kind of like Mike said with the RM thing, it'd be cool to see some actual examples that, you know, a landscape architect might have said, this is how you could do this. This is how you could make 0.4 work in that example, or 0.5 work or whatever.
We talked, and we actually did have a landscape architect look at what a 0.4, 0.5, and 0.6 looks like, assuming there's no critical areas. So again, what we think is, if you basically ignore the critical areas from a landscape perspective, the green factor score is working. And that's what we're noticing. And the reason why we changed some of the actual green factor scores is because we saw that 0.6 is pretty high. There are a lot of plants in there, and 0.4 you started to get really low in some housing types. And so we really tried to, again, we looked at that balance. And in single family, the single family housing forum, we had a little bit less concern, because single family home ownership usually gets some embellishment. People come in, they take their pride, they take their ownership, and they'll start to do sort of what they want. And we didn't necessarily felt that we had to give all that landscaping right up front, and that the homeowner should have some opportunity. There's no guarantee on any of those other housing types that they will be a for sale product, because they're not required to be. And so we feel like in those 6 situations, we should have a little bit more landscaping up front. So yes, Ollie, we did do that.
Yeah, I would just chime in here just with regards to the green factor. So the only housing type that required a green factor was townhouse. For garden court and shared court, it was optional. And when you utilized it, you got a floor area bonus. Cottage housing, because it's arranged around a central courtyard and the design standards specified how that courtyard should be embellished with landscaping. There was no green factor for that. There was no green factor for the single family or the duplex triplex. So our feeling in adding the green factor to the housing type, especially the lower ones, is that there should be a minimum landscaping requirement It shouldn't be anything extraordinary. It's just, it's a minimum. For the others, it just standardizes what that green factor will be for the townhouse, garden court, shared court, cottage housing. Just so, again, everything is treated more similarly rather than so differently. It did make the infill toolkit confusing when one is required, another is optional with bonus, another is not required just inherently because of the design, and then the other two just didn't require any landscaping, any green factor at all. So again, this is trying to standardize and make a basic requirement for all, and then identifying those that need a little bit more because they are developing at a more intense level. So that green factor helps to mitigate that higher intensity of development.
You can also think about it in this manner, that as these housing developments are going into established areas, one of the things that those established areas have is, mature vegetation and landscaping in them. So bringing these and trying to ensure that compatibility with this new development and how it fits in these existing areas is to make sure that they have landscaping associated with them so that they can start to blend a little bit more with homes and other developments that have been around for a very, very long time.
Yes.
Okay, let's jump right into the next section, multifamily design review.
With this one, if I'll just chime in right away here that, single family is a housing form, just standard single family does not require design review. It just goes straight to a building permit. It's a type 1. Multifamily development apartments, that's another housing form. It has standard development regulations, and then it requires design review to help implement and make it fit in. So apartment development just requires design review. Infill toolkit is another housing form, just another housing form. And it requires design review. It also requires a permit for infill housing. There's no reason for that infill housing permit. Everything is accomplished through design review. Just like apartment development, everything is accomplished through design review. So that's part of the reason for paring this down to just a single permit review type with design review is it levels the playing field between apartment development and infill toolkit.
Chris, why was it there in the first place then?
It was brand new. There was some uncertainty on how to implement it. And so there was thought that would just provide some additional regulatory surety to make sure that to catch any unusual circumstances. In practice, it has really all been dealt with through design review.
There's never anything that wouldn't get caught.
No, there really isn't anything that would be missed. Because just like with apartment development, you make sure that the design complies with the development standards. You make sure that the design complies with the design standards. It's no different with the infill toolkit. When an application comes in, a land use application comes in, you'd review it against the regulations for infill toolkit, and you'd review it against the regulations for design review. It's a land use permit for design review.
Good.
Yeah, I was just wondering, I know on the multifamily design guidelines, there's a lot of illustrations, probably more so than you have in infill toolkit, a lot of the language in the infill toolkit is based on scale and kind of like the nature of the design. I was wondering if you all thought about adding more graphics and illustrations to kind of like guide people in what the expectations are, considering that there will be this review.
Yeah, when you look in the staff report in the draft ordinance, you see a number of little call outs in the right-hand column that identify kind of placeholders where graphics may be appropriate. And the thought here was also that the board, if there were certain places where the commission, if there are certain sections that the commission thought would warrant a figure, a diagram, or picture, please let us know.
Kathy, can you go back to the matrix and take the actual ordinance off? I think that'll help us with the discussion a little bit. One thing that I'd like to add in this section, like Chris mentioned, multifamily design review and the tool, it's already required. So this isn't a new change. The change that we're proposing here is to no longer require two different applications and two different fees associated with it. So essentially, you have to, currently our code requires you to get multifamily design review, which is an application, and then you have to get an infill toolkit application. So those two need to occur now. But ultimately what's happening is we're doing design review for these toolkit forms. So we believe that we don't need to have two separate applications to do this, essentially what becomes the same review. So charging and only requiring that one application will help streamline this and make it easier. That's really the big change that's occurring with this section, is we're no longer requiring two applications, we're only requiring one here.
So my sheet that I got, I don't know if you guys can see that, but it's all cut off. I didn't have all this information at a time, or at least not in a functional form for me to use. So I'm wondering how come there's like all this, the cons are none identified, and especially for this one, for the one we're talking about now.
Well, ultimately, we don't believe that there is a con in trying to streamline our review process. Right now, like I said, you're having to fill out two separate forms, two separate applications. That there's no difference in a review process. We're doing it as we review the project. We're doing all of the review one time. We're not doing it twice. There's no separate like notices that happen to the public. There's no separate public comment periods that come into it. So honestly, streamlining this and making it a simpler process, we couldn't see a con to it.
Ultimately, the question is, why does an apartment building only require a design review permit application, just a single permit application, but infill housing, which is generally smaller scale development, why does that require two permits, which are seen as redundant permits, and two fees?
I think the other aspect of this discussion is talking about the process type and how we review these applications. Currently, because a planned development, or sorry, an infill housing permit is required, they're always type 2s. And what that means is they are processed in a manner that requires notice. They're all administrative decisions, but they require notice, and that's notice to 500 to a radius of 500 feet around the property boundary. What staff can share with you is the comments that we do receive for infill housing are typically, there's going to be too much traffic. They may have drainage concerns. They're not really getting at the heart of the real issues of design. which is really what these applications are, is a design review application. And to Chris's point of, you know, a single family residence right now just needs to go in for a building permit. There's no other, you know, land use requirements needed for that. We tried to look at scaling when infill should be sent out for notice. Like, when is it too big? When is it too small? You know, when should people have notice of what's going to go on, you know, next door to them or down the road? And one of the things that we landed on is that the current short plat process, if you are proposing 4 lots or less, it's a type 1, which means it's administrative with no notice. And anything more than that, you have to go through a type 2 process. So if you propose 5 lots, or call it 5 units, then we're providing notice and giving the neighborhood opportunity to comment. So we kind of drew the line there is just a bright line of if these are more of the scale to fit into the existing residences or into existing neighborhoods, then it felt to be like a consistent process than what we do for our current subdivisions. So we are also proposing not just to eliminate one application and have it be just a design review application, but we're also recommending that we do not notice, provide the opportunity for public comment on projects that consist of 4 or less units.
And I would just say that with Kathy's example there, currently with subdivisions, a short plat with 4 or less lots is a type 1 process. Well, those 4 lots can then be developed with 4 single family homes with just building permits, which are type 1 process. And there are no design standards associated with those type 1 processes. So why is a 4 unit infill housing project being held to a higher scrutiny when it has design standards compared to a 4 lot subdivision with 4 single family homes with no design review?
Ollie?
I agree with Chris. Yeah, I can take a piece of property and build 4 single family homes detached, and I have a type 1 process, no design review, no public notification. But if I want to build 4 houses that are smaller and cuter, I have to go through and are more in line with what we want. I have to go through a public notification process. It's an identical project probably, but there's more restrictions from a design perspective baked into the toolkit. So it just seems odd that we would want to apply. I think the shift to type 1 for 4 or fewer is great because it does create greater consistency. I wonder why we even are applying design review to 4 or fewer in this instance. You know, you could build a duplex in an RM zone and not have to do design review. But if you want to build an infill toolkit duplex in an RM zone, you have to do design review. You can build 4 single family homes without design review, but if you want to build 4 single family infill toolkit homes detached, you got to go through design review. So I don't think this goes far enough. I think we should have the bright line that we talked about be 5 units. And if you do a toolkit project with 5 or more, it's type 2 and has design review, which is consistent with an apartment building. And if it's 4 or fewer, it should be type 1, and we shouldn't have a design review process at all. Talk about making a barrier go away. Design review takes 6 months. You know, it costs tens of thousands of dollars in consultant costs. And so is there a way that and also there's duplicity in applying the multifamily design standards when you have design standards built into each housing form and in the general standards. We know what we want these to look like. We know we have like specifics in all these housing forms, you know, kind of like Jed was talking about. So is there a way that you could administer consistency with the infill toolkit standards through a building permit and issue findings and a decision on the planning side? This is a question for staff, through the building permit process without a land use entitlement at all, unless you had a plat, of course.
Sure, we can.
You can.
We could do design review with every building permit. The problem that we get into is that when you go into a building permit, you're really kind of already wedded to a certain design. So
Yeah.
if you prepare building permit documents that don't necessarily meet the code and you have to go back in and change that, then you're potentially changing architecture. I mean, you're changing your structural potentially, and to us that could cost even more. So
Yes.
We believe that that the design standards are needed. They're important. When you're starting to talk about higher densities, that's one of the key things, especially when you're going into established neighborhoods, is this need for some sort of design review. What we do believe is that there's that scale and that threshold of how many units, you can call it like by right development, that you're allowed to go through and just have this type 1 process without the public notification that goes on with it. One of the key things that you'll hear when you start talking about affordability is streamlining processes and trying to make them more consistent. The time is money. The longer it sits in a permitting review process, the longer and probably more expensive the unit's going to be. And streamlining the review process by not requiring the public comment component in that notice that goes out with it for a smaller scale of development is one way that we can definitely help get more units out on the street more quickly. And as Kathy and Chris have mentioned, we already have those thresholds set for when it comes to number of units in short plats and lots. So we felt that it was appropriate to just align that, modify it, streamline this section for 4 or less units and line it up with our existing codes.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think type 2 is type 1 for those projects is appropriate. I guess I just think that the application of the design review process I find onerous and for a small project. So and especially when you can do an identical small project in a different zone, like a single family zone, without that. So I guess what I'm getting at is, like, instead of eliminating the infill toolkit process and applying the design review process, I would have liked to have seen you eliminate the design review process and maybe still apply an infill toolkit permit, just make it only about the design standards in the toolkit. That could make it more efficient. It's easier. You don't have to write as many findings, not duplicating, design standards, and make it, that might build more efficiency. If you make a good point, Kurt, about you can't do it through a building permit because you fully baked your project by that point. You spent a lot of money. That's a good point. So I see that being a problem, but I think we could make it, making a 4-lot infill toolkit short plat go through design review when a 4-lot standard short plat doesn't have to. That to me just seems like extra. We're just creating extra bureaucracy. And the same is true for like a duplex, an infill toolkit duplex, because you don't have to do that for an RM duplex. And most of these projects are being built in multifamily neighborhoods. So what we're protecting is the single family homeowners who built their homes in multifamily neighborhoods, protecting that character, and we talked about with the RM code update, how that was a problem we created for ourselves. So now we're protecting those people from that problem. So I just feel like we could go further with, I love the switch to type 1 for 4 or fewer. I feel like we could go farther with making the process easier from a land use entitlement design review process for 4 or fewer. I guess that's what I'm getting at.
Okay, I think I want to pause here and put a pin on the 5th section as our starting off point. Thanks everyone for the great, robust, long conversations. And thanks to staff for entertaining all our questions and commentary. Can someone on staff take us through just final thoughts and what we can expect in 2 weeks, or in the meantime, if there's a revision to the document or just kind of picking up with additional context, that kind of stuff?
Well, I guess what we heard some good comments tonight. We obviously will need to sit down and discuss some of them internally to see what we believe is the best approach to making some of those. I think one of them that I can tell you right now, eliminating the affordability component in that first section. Just listening to the comments, discussion, I think that's something that staff can put back in there. It is important. We are looking for the future, and though it may not be happening now, it's something that can happen definitely in the future. So I think that's one that we can see right away. I think there's some other ones that we need to have some internal discussion with. It's possible that we will really kind of focus in on the comments that we heard tonight and really show you specific code areas and kind of get into the details and the weeds on those areas. There may be additional code changes that are presented in the future based on the comments that we've heard tonight.
I think the other thing is you can anticipate a response to the public comment that has been received, and that we will, because we did receive quite a few letters in written form, and we will address that comment as well.
Okay, and for those people still on the Zoom from the public, written comment is welcome for 13 days until the day before the next meeting. We will see you all in 2 weeks. With that, we'll adjourn. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.